Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy and very pleased to welcome you to this special program that we are co-sponsoring with Joseph Humire, one of our presenters, the Executive Director of the very highly regarded Center for a Secure Free Society here in Washington, D.C. We're going to be talking about Latin America and its present trajectory, the very considerable challenges that are being posed to freedom-loving people throughout the hemisphere, and the very considerable dangers that arise from those challenges for the United States, especially if some of the choices that will be made in successive governments and nations in the next few months go badly. We have an extraordinarily important and thoughtful group of panelists today, and I will be introducing each of them in a moment. Let me just make some introductory remarks, if I can, before that. My old boss, Ronald Reagan, used to say, every generation faces an existential threat to freedom, and that continued enjoyment of freedom is not passed on through the bloodstream. It must be fought for. It must be defended. It must be then passed on to the next generation to do the same. For a generation or two, at least, in the United States, I think too few of us have been paying sufficient attention to developments that are giving rise to existential threats to freedom in various parts of the world, honestly, but most especially in what I think of as our front yard, namely Latin America. And that's in part because some of those challenges, some of those threats, some of those adversaries elsewhere around the world are now present in and exercising ever greater influence over the affairs of Latin America in a number of countries that have in particular become governed by communist regimes, others in which the Iranian Republic, as well as its proxy, Hezbollah, are now active. The combined effect of which, together with the various proxies, clients, puppets that have been established by one or the other of those forces, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and others, now are creating an indigenous problem, perhaps best represented and certainly most actively promoted by the Forum of Sao Paolo. We're going to talk about all of this in the context of the recent, frankly, disastrously and fraudulently conducted election in Peru, and then what's coming next, most immediately this weekend in Chile, and next year in Colombia and Brazil, the cumulative effects of which could profoundly affect the nature of Latin America, the prospects for freedom-loving people being able to both enjoy their freedoms and their prosperity, or be condemned, as have been so many others already in the hemisphere, to a life of poverty, oppression, and misery at the hands of one form of totalitarianism or another. We, in this program, certainly here at the Center for Security Policy, and I think I can speak for the rest of our team, are determined not to have that happen. And we're going to be talking about both why it must not and what we can do to try to prevent it. I'm very pleased to be joined by, as I say, remarkable people with great expertise in, and in most cases, a deep connection to Latin America. We're going to start with my co-sponsor, Joseph Humire. As I mentioned, he is the executive director of a marvelous organization, the Center for a Secure Free Society. He is formerly a United States Marine who, in various other parts of the world served in Latin America. He has served as well with Unitas and did multinational training for a number of nations in the region. He is also a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute and a great colleague and partner, and we're thrilled to have him with us. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Frank. It's always a privilege to be able to partner with a prominent think tank like the Center for Security Policy. I've always been able to be privileged to have your friendship in this struggle for the free world throughout the entire globe. I'm also delighted and honored to share this virtual stage with two great freedom champions, Carlos Ponce, who from Venezuela, and the Honorable Francisco Tudela from Peru. So I think this is going to be a very interesting and productive discussion. I'll only take about 8 or 9 minutes or so to give some remarks. And what I like to do is I like to put this in a kind of a global context and how this fits into the region that we're talking about, Latin America. Let me begin by making the first point, which is what you were talking about, Frank, in terms of strategy. We live in this era that has been described as great power competition. I like to refer more to great power conflict, because I think there's more conflict among these nations, these global powers, than there is competition. In that framework, we look at China, we look at Russia as what they call, Defense Department would call near-peer adversaries, meaning that they're global powers that can rival the United States in certain domains, in certain aspects, and particularly in influence in different parts of the world. And then you have Iran, who's not necessarily considered a global power, but they consider themselves a global power, but nonetheless have different capabilities, particularly in asymmetric warfare. And here's where I kind of make my point. I think in any conflict, competition, or more specifically in warfare, there's two ingredients that you need to ensure that you're successful. The first is political will, and the second is strategy. And this is where the United States has been lacking. We arguably have not had a political will to prioritize Latin America within national security strategy or our U.S. foreign policy, arguably since the time, Frank, that you were in government, since the Reagan administration. And I think we had a necessity to do so back then because of the encroachment of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, particularly in Central America. But the second part of it is strategy. And this isn't, the United States is not that it had a deficit of strategic vision on Latin America. There's been many iterations of having attempted strategies in Latin America, perhaps not very successful. And this is my second point. I want to cover a little bit of quick history here. And I know both Francisco and Carlos know this very well. But the W. Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, at the turn of the century, the Cold War ended, and this actually began at the end of the Clinton administration, develop a strategy for Latin America so the United States can engage, but mostly on the commercial front, to be able to build commercial relationships with the region so that we can have an integrated region on free trade. In fact, the agreement was called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. In Spanish, it would have gone by the acronym of ALCA. So this prompted a direct reaction by the authoritarian socialist regimes in the region that were emerging at the time, most notably Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. And there's a development here that we know very well as the Latin America watchers, but most of the general public, particularly in the United States, hasn't really paid attention to, was the development of the counterpart or the counterweight to the ALCA, or the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which was the ALBA. The Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas is perhaps one of the more underestimated developments in Latin America in the 21st century. If you measured it in terms of conventional strengths, the size of their economies, strength of their militaries, political influence in multilaterals, you wouldn't necessarily be too impressed, because the ALBA was among the smaller economies, among the weaker militaries in the region. But the ALBA was never designed in that manner. The ALBA was designed from day one, and they gave it a different spin. They talked about it as an economic integration project. They talked about it as a regional integration effort. But in reality, what the ALBA was, it had three elements. It had a political element, ideological element that was specifically designed to steer the region more towards specific external actors that are not the United States. It wanted to steer the region away from the United States. It had a criminal element that was much more visible later on as the ALBA started to become more noticeable. But it really started from day one. I mean, the Chavez regime in Venezuela, the Evo Morales regime in Bolivia, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and then there's always been the Castros in the Cuba, always had ties to transnational organized crime, or what another colleague, Douglas Farah, noted security expert, would call criminalized states. And then lastly, it had an informational aspect. It was designed to drive a narrative in Latin America that worked for a specific period of time. After a while, it stopped working because basically the humanitarian disasters and economic crisis started to take fold. But that's kind of where the Foro Sao Paulo becomes a part of that. It's become a part of those legs. The ALBA had infrastructure. It had teeth at some point. It had its own bank. It had its own fiber optic, its own state-owned media network. It had many elements that could give it a little bit more infrastructure than these other elements that were born out of that, or they were developed before it, but really gave it the amplification that it needed to be more powerful in Latin America. And that moves me to my third point, which is about the Foro Sao Paulo. And I'm sure Carlos and Francisco will talk more about this, but the perspective that I've been able to develop about the Foro Sao Paulo is the Foro Sao Paulo is essentially a informational aspect that allows the ALBA as the core of it to be able to project specific narratives and even to install certain counter narratives that are beneficial to its geopolitical objectives. Two main things I think capture the essence of the Foro Sao Paulo. The first is ideological, and this has become more important over time because we understand the criminal aspects of a lot of these networks that are tied between state and non-state actors in Latin America, but we often discount that there's an ideological element that's equally as important. And what the Foro Sao Paulo did for the Bolivarian nations and their allies was allow them to project ideological messages that would allow non-state actors to be lumped under a big umbrella. But the second, and I think this is most important in today's current landscape, and it's a huge challenge for democracies worldwide, is disinformation. The Foro Sao Paulo has transformed to become a digital disinformation effort at driving false narratives and fake news, essentially, throughout the entire Latin America, essentially accusing the United States of everything from COVID to essentially being a colonizer of certain countries in the region. But among those disinformation actors that are part of the Foro Sao Paulo, I call them digital activists that are part of the Foro de Sao Paulo digital network, there's also an element of misdirection. Always understanding that disinformation, as opposed to propaganda or misinformation, is fundamentally a counterintelligence effort. And so in that sense, the Foro Sao Paulo also serves to distract its opponents from specific things that they don't want them to focus on. I could give some examples later in the presentation, which brings me to, I think, my final point, which is what are they distracting from? I think the main essence is they don't want to talk about certain aspects that are happening on the geopolitical level, and they prefer to talk about the intricacies of things that are happening at the local level to distract from what China, Russia, and Iran are actually doing in Latin America. And this goes me to when we talked, Frank, when you asked me to join you in this webinar, we talked about this potential for a new Monroe initiative or something of the likes. Now, I don't necessarily know if the Monroe doctrine essentially is what we would use as a potential title, but the spirit of the doctrine is very important, particularly some aspects of it. Let's remember the Monroe doctrine that was developed in the 19th century under President Monroe had a purpose that was adequate for the time, which was European powers and the fact that Latin Americans were leaving Spanish colonization and moving into becoming new democracies. But the element that I think that's most relevant of the Monroe doctrine that needs to be rescued and needs to be implemented is the non-colonization aspect of it. Because one of the things that spurred the Monroe doctrine during the 19th century was to have no more colonies of European powers in Latin America. Now, that isn't as relevant as it once was, but the new colonizers in Latin America are Russia, China, and Iran, particularly China. So I think that that's where I'll end, because I think the neo-colonization of China that's happening globally, but specifically happening in Latin America, is at the heart of what Forum of Sao Paolo and Alba steered the region to be able to do. So this essentially wasn't done by accident. It wasn't done by default. It was done because the United States got distracted and our adversaries occupied the region closest to home.
Joseph, thank you very much. That historical context and background that helps us explain how we got to this point is incalculably important, and I appreciate you sharing it with us. And particularly the point that you made at the end there about the neo-colonialism that really is what's fueling the activities, most notably and most aggressively, of Communist China as it pursues the so-called Belt and Road Initiative that is at the core of, I think, an imperial build-out. But beyond that, I think this question of what are entities like the Forum of Sao Paulo actually doing to try to advance the agenda of the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and so many others. And we'll be talking about that with our subsequent panelists. I did want to just mention that among Joseph Humeyer's other credentials is he is the author of an important book about Iran's strategic penetration of Latin America. So he knows whereof he speaks on these subjects, and we're very appreciative of his support for this effort and participation. Next up, we're going to hear from the Honorable Francisco Tudela. He is a former, well, just about everything in his country, former member of Congress, former foreign minister, a former hostage at the hands of the Shining Paths counterpart terrorist organization, ETA. He is also, I believe, a very important figure, not least because of his role in the constitution of his country and as its former first vice president. We're very honored to have him with us, as we did in some previous programs here at the Center for Security Policy. And I wanted to just tease a new paper that he has just authored, which we hope to have out today, about the threat posed to our hemisphere by the new government of Peru, a communist government. Francisco Tudela, thank you very much for joining us today, and we're delighted to have you. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm delighted by the invitation you have, the Center for Security Policy, and you, as its executive chairman, has extended to me for this webinar we are holding now. I think that what Joseph has exposed is very important. Since the beginning of the 2000s, there was the America's initiative by the US to try to build a free trade zone from from the United States to the Tierra del Fuego, to the southern cone of South America. That initiative was in a certain way kidnapped in its own summits by Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, who were able in the 2010s to change the agenda. And it wasn't anymore continental free trade, but the agenda was changed to specific subjects. The last one being corruption in the continent, that is far away from what was the original intention. At the same time, there is a network that Joseph has exposed and explained very clearly, the ALBA at its core as the most ideological movement. But then you had the UNASUR, and that was the attempt to build an alternative OAS, but without the United States and without Canada. And it reached its apogee around the year 2015. Most Latin American countries became members of UNASUR and became members of a parallel economic organization whose first president was Raúl Castro, that was the CELAC, an economic community of Latin American nations. And behind these organizations that contemplated not only UNASUR as a political forum, but the development of UNASUR military force supplied by contingents from the different Latin American countries. Behind that, you had Russia and China, with the main initiative that was to substitute the dollar as the currency of international trade through the concept of the BRICS. And so the BRICS were the countries that were behind the initiative of substituting the dollar for alternative currencies, and those were Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil. Brazil was the essential actor in Latin America. I would say that the fall of Dilma Rousseff, because she was involved in the Petrobras scandal, the financing of the Partido of the Workers' Party of Lula by funds from Petrobras, and Mensalão, the duplication of salaries for opposition members that voted for the government. All those scandals in a certain way took Brazil away from the structure of the BRICS, and in a certain way attenuated the pressure from China and Russia over Latin America, because the main instruments that were used to pressure the continent and to have a very strong influence were diminished or collapsed, like was the case of UNASUR, that is now a kind of non-entity. But anyway, all these structures had a function. And I think the Forum of Sao Paulo has a very essential function beyond disinformation or fake news or just propaganda. Because if you go into the website of the Forum of Sao Paulo, you will see that the Forum of Sao Paulo proposes the essential agenda for Latin America and what is called the socialism of the 21st century. But of course, the socialism of the 21st century cannot be adopted by Latin American countries unless they have a strong left-wing Marxist-leaning movements that are endogenous to each of the Latin American countries. And that has been the case of my country, the case of Peru. Peruvian left is not a consequence of ALBA, nor a consequence of UNASUR or CELAC, and the position of the government and its shift in foreign policy from a clear pro-US Western policy to a more pro-Chinese Russian-centered foreign policy is produced because of the ideological tenets of the Peruvian left itself. It's so to have the workings of all this international network acting, what you really need is to have endogenous Marxist movements that will operate inside those guidelines. In the case of Peru, Peru was a success story. I would say that during the 2000s, it had a high growth rate. The privatizations and economic measures, pro-market economic measures that were taken in the 1990s were preserved by the successive governments, but corruption began to seep into the democratic system. And at the same time, we had a great political conflictivity inside the country that had led finally to the victory of Pedro Castillo. Pedro Castillo has won the elections due to several factors. First of all, demoralization due to the high level of government corruption since 2001, since the Toledo government, and the antecedents, the elements that depressed Peruvian morality before that was the corruption of Vladimir Montesinos, the intelligence chief of Fujimori, and in a certain way, the tandem game that both Fujimori and Montesinos had with respect to bribing members of the opposition and media owners. So in fact, the Odebrecht scandal showed that all the political class, democratic, authoritarian, whatever you want to qualify it, was corrupt. So that was the central element that permitted the resurrection of the far left in Peru as a kind of moral force outside the workings of the establishment. The second factor was the COVID-19 epidemic and the incapacity of the governments who had to tackle this epidemic to confront it. The government of President Vizcarra just didn't act. They didn't take any measures, they didn't buy the vaccines, the contracts that should have been signed with Pfizer were delayed until October 2020 and finally were not signed. Finally, the contracts were signed with the Chinese, and the deficiency of the public health system in a country that had a substantial income for the regional governments and for the central governments, and that had surpluses in the budget that couldn't be efficiently spent, was a big problem. And the third factor was the political narrative, because the political narrative had been centered on anti-Fujimorism. It had legitimate reasons initially. Once President Fujimori, intelligence chief Montesinos, and the generals around them were imprisoned, were condemned, you would say that the objective of anti-Fujimorismo had been attained. But no, it became a kind of kinetic energy for Peruvian politics. And when the moment came in this last election, anti-Fujimorismo took the upper hand of the political narrative. And people didn't perceive that the dilemma wasn't anymore between Fujimorismo and the left candidates, in this case, Pedro Castillo, who never hid that his party was Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, who never hid that he wanted a new constitution, who never hid that he wanted to intervene in the great mining projects as it's happening now, who never hid that he wants to nationalize gas and oil. he, in a certain way, was the beneficiary of this false dilemma in which people felt ashamed to vote for Fujimorismo and at the same time were angry because of the epidemic of COVID-19 and demoralized because not only the huge corruption that the Odebrecht case exposed in Peru had a huge impact on Peruvian population, but at the same time, the actions of the prosecutors led to nothing. There is no one that is arrested or condemned or accused because of the Odebrecht case, and we've had this for 5 or 6 years. So the combination of these factors led Pedro Castillo, with, it seems, some help from the electoral authorities that were confronted not only by the Fujimori party, but after the first round, but by Renovación Nacional of Rafael López Aliaga and even by Hernando de Soto. They challenged irregularities in the election, and the electoral jury discarded those claims as improcedente, that they just didn't proceed without examining the merits of the case. Now there are several legal actions that drag on about this question of the fraud, but in fact, for practical purposes, that fraud is now over. It's not taken into account. The fact is that Pedro Castillo won the elections with a kind of small coup de pouce that helped him to get, because it's very interesting to see how Pedro Castillo won by 44,000 votes against Keiko Fujimori, and Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, 5 years before, won against Keiko Fujimori also by 44,000 votes. So it's statistically an oddity to have the same number repeating itself in 2 elections. But anyway, let's not get into that, because that is a matter of proof, and the electoral jury didn't want to get into the merits of the case. The fact is that now we have a Marxist-Leninist Maoist government. They are Mariateístas. That means that they are a brand of communism that in the past was rejected by the USSR and Moscow, in which the racial element is very important, in which Marxist-Leninism becomes the vehicle for racial revenge, for oppressed peoples, ethnic peoples against the dominant classes of a Spanish or foreign origin. This has led recently to the proposal to have a summit of originary political movements, ethnically originary political movements in Cusco, called the Runa Sur. Runa in Quechua means people, people of the South. And Evo Morales has stated that this summit that would have been taking place on the 21st and 22nd of December was against the empire, that is against the US, and it was anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and anti-capitalist. Anyway, there is a merge in Peru of the ethnic factors that have been reiterated several times by the new head of state, Pedro Castillo, with the Marxist-Leninist tenets. And there is, at the same time, a consolidation of the far left after the failure of Congress, its premature initiative of vacating Pedro Castillo on moral grounds. The Constitution permits this. Article 113 of the Constitution allows for this initiative of Congress, but maybe the moment wasn't ripe, even if there were evident acts of corruption and of transgressing the law and regulations on several aspects of public policy. Anyway, the situation now is that there is a very strong presence of China, even if the Chinese are not happy with Castillo, because it's affecting their interests, the main mining interests, and the main mine, Chinese operated mine, that is Las Bambas, has stopped yesterday morning its operations, and the Chinese are getting out of Peru. That mine represents 2% of all the copper production in the world and represents 17% of the Peruvian net internal revenue. And so you can have an idea of the magnitude of the anti-mining, of the results of the anti-mining movement that is promoted by the President of the Council of Ministers, Mrs. Mirta Vázquez, with the passive consent of President Pedro Castillo. And of course, what we are seeing in Peru is the development of a combination of factors in which international factors are important. The left or far left network of the Forum of Sao Paolo, the idea of the socialists of the 21st century, the idea of using democratic systems to get into power and then have constituent assemblies, referendums, etc., and change the rules to remain in power forever, are in operation in Peru. But at the same time, Peru has an endogenous far left movement that is very old, from the 1930s, that has this peculiarity of the coincidence of Mariateísmo with Maoism, and that has at this moment deepened the Peruvian recession in a very dramatic way. And all economic factors are now indicators are negative, and we are facing a huge recession. And the proposal of the government to face that recession is to tackle that recession, is to rise interest rates and to rise taxes, as we know from the 1929 experience and the policies that were adopted in 1930 when the Great Depression began. Those are just the policies you cannot take, but they will take them because their intention is to destroy big business. It's an offensive legislation that Congress is trying to contain that will affect mining interests, banking interests, etc., and begin to diminish the economic solvency of the Peruvian middle classes. So that, I would say, is the situation in Peru. There is a strong Russian presence since the 1960s. It's not a new thing. There is a very strong Chinese presence in Peru, 170 corporations, banking, insurance, mining, ports, etc. But that is happening in all the continent. The Chinese presence is random all over the continent. They administer now the Panama Canal, and so one should admit that China has profited from the lack of attention of the US towards its Latin American policy. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It's important to have this case study of what happens in a country in Latin America when it falls to the communists. It's the case, as all of us understand, certainly, and I hope increasingly people in the region and here as well recognize, it's inevitable when the communists take over, that they will destroy economies, not enrich people, not improve their lives. And it hopefully will be an object lesson for those in Chile who are now countenancing the idea of turning their country over to a full-on communist, and perhaps others in the region doing the same in the course of next year. I wanted to conclude our panel's wonderful presentations with some remarks by Carlos Ponce. He is a Venezuelan originally, now an American, who is a senior fellow at the Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation, an extraordinarily important organization in Washington, as well as its director of Latin American programs. He's deeply knowledgeable about the region, about the sorts of challenges our previous two speakers have addressed, and brings to it as well academic credentials as a lecturer at Columbia University and Johns Hopkins University. And we're very pleased to have him with us today to round up this program. And the floor is yours, Carlos.
Oh, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I agree with Joseph that at the U.S. level, lack of public policy, lack of political will, and lack of strategy, and the blind behavior, so nothing's happening, and we don't want to rock the boat, has been going on for decades. Maybe the last time that we had a policy, good or bad, for Latin America was under Reagan, and then Clinton with the economic plan for the region, and fell apart. And then it came the war, Iraq, Afghanistan, and no policy for Latin America, just short-term approaches to the region. And that has been leaving the field open for authoritarians from communist tendencies to dominate the region. They lost some control of the region for a short period of time, but they recovered. Because what we have to understand is that they have a long-term plan. And the long-term plan is something that they have been followed. A long-term plan that also include media, social media, legal and illegal funds, cooperation among them, structures, alliances, message. They have all the structure there. And sometimes they lost one election, but they learned from the process and improve the strategy. Yes, we have Puebla, we have Sao Paulo. They have a plan, they have a strategy, but where is the alternative? Where is the alternative to this regime? We talk openly about Puebla, we talk openly about Sao Paulo, but the reality is in the other side. There's no coordinated effort to stop this, to bring an alternative to counterbalance the advance of this group. There's no alternative to the coordination among China, illegal groups, terrorists, narco, drug dealers, money laundering, and this regime. They have a coordinated effort, they operate together, and they support each other. In the other side, there is no coordination. There's no investment. We talk a lot about what's going on in each one of these countries, but it's not a coordinated effort in terms of investing in education, in terms of improving political parties, in terms of supporting a positive leadership in those countries, in terms of coordination among student movements, in terms of involving more in the media and developing a strong media to counterbalance the media that support this group. There's no solidarity, there's no plan. There's just rhetoric. That's all. We have to fight against them. Yeah, we know that. We know that. But how are we going to fight against that? How are we going to coordinate a long-term plan, not a short-term reaction to each one of these elections? It is about also, yes, let's review the history of some of these countries. We can review and begin with my country, Venezuela. We had the opportunity to prevent Hugo Chavez. And some of us, we tried to prevent Hugo Chavez. There was no response. The private sector, the political elites, decided to support Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez has support from the business, has support from the political parties. And in the other side, nobody reacted against Hugo Chavez. Even when we took Hugo Chavez out of power, there was no support from the international community to leave Hugo Chavez outside. In the election the only election that Hugo Chavez lost, that was a referendum coordinated by the student, I was part of the coordination behind the student. And the US began to invest in that initiative, not to just to show some solidarity. The surprise was when they won, Chavez lost the referendum, but then the US pulled it back because the US was afraid of rocking the vote. So there's no reaction, there's no prevention. In the case of Castillo, yes, we have to agree that at the end, Castillo won because of this anti-Fujimori reaction and other factors. But the problem is Keiko has been candidate over and over and over in each election, and with support from several groups that have been supporting the anti-Fujimori reaction in the second round. And that has been the case, and that happened the same with Castillo. But the thing is, before that, more than 10, 20 candidates dividing the vote. Yes, Castillo only had before the election 5% of the popular vote in all the polls, and suddenly he got into the second round and got elected because of some of the media owners, some of the members of the business sector are not planning ahead against this advance of this regime. We're gonna see Lula again in October, and Lula it's a problem because he's a big puppet master. He is the one who controls it in certain way all the movement that we see right now, putting his political strategy in a coordination with Cuba. And the money from Hugo Chavez in that moment allowed the pink tide to cover the whole region. I can say the same about Honduras. Xiomara Castro, the wife from Zelaya, won the election. But she won because of 14 years of bad government from the people that's supposed to help Honduras not to return to Zelaya. And the business sector was involved. The business sector in Nicaragua knows that. They sued me several years ago when I began to say that the private sector was supporting Daniel Ortega. Until 3-4 years ago, the COSEP in Honduras was hand by hand working with Daniel Ortega. And some of the members of the opposition were working directly with Daniel Ortega. Now they are persecuted. The guy who sued me now is the head of the COSEP in Nicaragua. So that is the behavior that no preventing, and the same with Chile. I can continue with Chile. We had the opportunity to prevent what's going on, and Piñera had no intention to stop the changes that were going on in Chile. And now we see what's going to happen in Chile, and probably Chile is going to be another factor. Same with Colombia. Colombia had the opportunity to begin a program years ago. I had a long conversation years ago with Juan Manuel Santos, of course, wasting my time. But at that time, it was the crisis of Venezuela was on the verge, and also the possibility of the left state taking control of Colombia. And that can be happening in Colombia with Gustavo Petro next year. So it's a matter also of taking ownership of what we have been doing. It's preventing also. Is knowing what is the situation of the region. We know that the penetration of China, the soft landing of China in Latin America has been the case for several years. But what is the alternative of some of these countries? What is the alternative to the business sector? The business sector also has been cheering the participation of China in several of these countries, has been opening the door for business with China. So what is the alternative? What are we doing to stop this from happening? That's the question that I have, and I don't want to extend because we already have extraordinary presentation. But my point is that we need to change the behavior from just rhetoric approaches to begin to plan, to have a long-term plan, how we will stop this from happening, how we will recover the region and bring democracy and freedom, rule of law, and economic prosperity to the region again.
Carlos, thank you very much. This is a perfect teeing up of what I hope we can do in the remaining couple of minutes. And I know you have to leave promptly at 2, so hopefully we can get you to comment before you go. I just wanted to say, Joseph mentioned an idea that sort of the working title of it is a Monroe initiative. That may change, but the object of this is to help identify and encourage things that can be done at this moment, as President Monroe envisioned a century more ago, to prevent our hemisphere from being subjected to anti-freedom external forces that will endanger our hemisphere, not advance it. A couple of principles for this initiative might be the Western Hemisphere is a prime target for such non-regional actors seeking to subvert or otherwise dominate nations whose people want to live in freedom and prosperity. We've heard from Francisco Tudela how much that is not the case in his native Peru at the moment, as one example. The Forum of Sao Paolo is one of the mechanisms being used by such extra-hemispheric enemies of liberty to support their regional clients and proxies and to help them undermine freedom-loving neighbors. Thirdly, it is in the vital interests of the United States and others in the Western Hemisphere to share its commitment to free people and free markets, to resist such external adversaries and to thwart their plans, effectively to conquer Latin America. And in this spirit, it behooves those who love liberty to join forces in a new initiative, rooted in a shared conviction that nations outside the Western Hemisphere must not be permitted either directly or indirectly to penetrate, otherwise exercise control, let alone enjoy a colonial domination of our hemisphere's people, countries, and resources. So the question that I would like to put, Carlos, maybe to you quickly before you leave, and to our other panelists is, what other specific things might we do to give effect to such principles?
First, we have to find a way to control the social media, not control, finding a way to have a real penetration of the social media with message and with information. That's one of the key elements that Puebla and Sao Paulo has been using, controlling the social media, controlling the social movement. We have to also find a way to organize students and other groups that support free thinking and support the market economy to begin to organize movement also in those countries to counterbalance the effort. We also need to help the US government to find the way to have a foreign policy. We don't have foreign policy, and needs to be an effective long-term planning for foreign policy. We have to turn our faces and with investment in the region and begin to support some of the business sector in the region to begin to provide some wealth in those countries. And also, we have to strengthen in political parties and leadership in the countries. There's no political parties in any countries, and this disaster has been driving these small movements like Castillo, for example, in Peru, to have a game open. And we have to begin to coordinate among all the different groups and penetrate also the universities and bring in new ideas to the youth and student movements in the region. That's just to start.
Thank you very much. A very important list, and I know you're working on many of those issues at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you for joining us, and we'll say goodbye when you punch out. Francisco, I know you have something to say on this too, but I believe that Joseph may have to leave as well. Can I go to him next? Any thoughts on what needs to be done now, Joseph?
Yes, thank you, Frank. Thank you, Frank. And I agree 100% with what Carlos was talking about in terms of we need to go past the rhetoric. We need to go past just talking about the region. We need to go past just talking how bad China is. America has to represent something. We can't just go to Latin America and say, you can't work with China, you can't trade with China, you got to watch out for Huawei, watch out for ZTE. We have to say, why other alternatives. First, you have to present alternatives and explain why those are better. Latin American, at the end of the day, are somewhat pragmatists. They're going to go in the direction that best suits their immediate short-term needs. Latin Americans don't often have a long-term strategy outside of some of these communists and other subversive actors. But I'm going to point to a couple of things, Frank, just to kind of wrap this up in terms of what I think we need to go. The first is we have to get outside, and this is mostly a message to my Latin America friends. We have to get outside of this insular view. Whenever I talk to our Latin America friends in the region, a lot of them have a view that their boogeyman is the worst boogeyman. If you talk to Venezuela, it's Maduro. If you talk to the Bolivians, it's Evo. If you talk to the Nicaraguans, it's Daniel Ortega. In reality, they're networks. And they don't respect borders, and they don't respect the sovereign territory of these countries. They work through illicit economies, they work through illicit actors, so that they move at the speed of light, while bureaucracies move at the speed of government, and that's oftentimes way inefficient. We need to adopt this transnational, and I would even say trans-regional view to how these threat actors operate in Latin America. The way Iran or Russia or China can integrate into Latin America is much quicker than the way the United States can, because we have a fundamental kind of bureaucratic view of how we need to do our bilateral relations. The second point is, I think we need to restudy the region, and this is mostly to my American colleagues and friends. A lot of things, a lot of assumptions, a lot of conventional wisdom that we have about Latin America isn't necessarily correct. We need to go back and do the homework. A lot of us did not do the homework. I'll give you one small example, and I don't want to make this a whole point of discussion, but I've spoken about this with Carlos quite a bit, him being from Venezuela. But the common conventional wisdom in Washington is that Hugo Chavez is a product of Cuba and Fidel Castro. Well, obviously the Cubans and Castro had a lot of influence in Venezuela and were definitely major actors. But if you do the homework, if you study the history of the Bolivarian Revolution, you realize that's just not the case. The number one influencer over Hugo Chavez was Syria, way and above Cuba. And if you understand the nature of their asymmetric strategies, Venezuela represents much more similar to what's happening in Syria than what happened in Cuba. But that's just one example. There's a lot of things that we have to restudy Latin America once again to have a very nuanced understanding of how to counter these threats. And finally, I'd say the main difference between, if we look at what I talked about a little bit in my presentation, these ebbs and flows of political spectrums and where the Bolivarian Alliance kind of came in at the beginning of the 21st century. If you look at it from kind of the political pendulum that swings left and right, the first decade of the 21st century certainly swung left, and the Bolivarian Alliance captured that moment. But there were other governments that weren't necessarily part of that benefited as well, even the first Michelle Bachelet administration in Chile. Then the pendulum swung naturally to the right, and a lot of more market-friendly presidents started to come into power in Central and South America. But here's the main difference between the leftist networks and the more right-of-center networks in the region. The leftist networks had a geopolitical vision, as Carlos mentioned, kind of long-term plan of what they wanted to do in the region, and two, they understand that their power resides in non-state networks. It's not the state institutions that's going to give them their powers, their ability to have non-state networks. When the more right-of-center presidents came into power in Latin America, they did not have a geopolitical vision. They thought they could trade with China, they could do arms deals with Russia, and they could still be the United States' best friend in the same kind of geopolitical context. That's just not synonymous or consistent with how the world is shaping. And two, they did not invest into non-state networks. They thought their legitimacy came from just being in power with state institutions. This is how Cristina Kirchner persisted and returned to power in Argentina. This is how Evo Morales persisted and is back not in government, but he's back in power in Bolivia. This is how Rafael Correa almost came back into power in Ecuador through a puppet president if he had won the election. And this is how, in many essence, a lot of the leftists kind of come back, even though when you think they're done in Latin America. Non-state networks is the fundamental of how they derive their legitimacy, and they manipulate those networks to their favor. So I'll just end with this, Frank. I think, I agree with all the panels, with what Francisco said, what Carlos said. I think we need to go past rhetoric. We have an important election this weekend in Chile. Well, hopefully that turns out favorably to our free market friends in the country, in the region. But the most important elections are next year in Colombia and Brazil. that's going to define the region for a decade or more to come, depending on what happens in those two elections. So the clock is ticking, and we're running out of time.
Joseph, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. I know you have to scoot too. Francisco Tudela, if you have a few minutes, if you would share with us what you would like our audience to understand needs to be done now.
I think that Carlos and Joseph have tackled the problem. I do believe that social media is crucial, but not only social media in Latin America, but social media in the US. So we need a strategy by which Latin American problems are explained in the US press and media in general, because we need to have a strategy, a continental strategy led by the US. The US has to be informed of the policies that should be taken and of what's happening in Latin America. It's impossible for the US to have a Latin American strategy if Americans are unaware of the existence of Latin America. So a huge effort has to be made in the American media to transmit the situation of Latin America, the problems of Latin America, and the alternatives. About academia, I'm skeptic, because academia all around the world, not only Latin America, has taken a route of political correctness and of Gramscian mentality of, because the left has had the capacity of posing its propaganda and its proposals at the cultural level. They have conquered the superstructure, the culture, religion, folklore, popular elements, etc. And the right has been concentrated talking about the economy. But the economy by itself, it's not attractive as a political engine. As a political engine, you have to take into account the whole of Latin American culture. And so this kind of denigration of Latin American culture, and at the same time applauses due to successes in the economic field, have shown not to be the right policy. So the policy has to be redrawn in a certain way. The US has to think, we all have to think about how a cultural reconquest of Latin America can be made. And last but not least, civil society. In the case of Peru, the National Society of Industries is supporting Castillo, because they believe that he will attack extractive industries, oil, mining, etc., but the industrial activities will not be affected. So you have a division inside the productive sector, and that shows that we Latin Americans have to work at the level of civil society, as it was done in Central Europe, as it was done in Serbia to topple down Milosevic, as it was done in Ukraine for the Orange Revolution and to topple down Yanukovych, even as it was done in Egypt with very bad results in the Arab Spring. But anyway, it's from civil society that resistance must come, but for that we need a strategy that takes into account the specifics of Latin American culture and not only a proposal of free trade. We have to go beyond the proposals of free trade and tell people what is freedom, what are the philosophical foundations of that freedom, what does the person, the individual, means in this culture, and contrast that with the Marxist view. If we don't fight at the level of humanity, not only of economics, at the level of what is a human being and what is its objective in history, we will be lost.
Francisco Tudela, thank you for those important sort of closing comments about both conditions in your own country and what we need to do about the region more generally. Let me just add a couple of thoughts of my own and we'll wrap up. I want to say that I think the points that have been made by our panelists about the importance of Latin America to the United States, and therefore the importance of the United States having both an appreciation of what's going on in our hemisphere and having an effective policy for addressing it is, of course, the sine qua non of what we must be doing now in the context of this challenge posed by the neo-colonialists, by the totalitarians, by their proxies in our hemisphere, essentially to turn the entirety of our continent, certainly south of our border, into a hostile zone for the United States and its interest. The implications of that, as Francisco Tudela has talked with us about in the past, are, of course, a proliferation, perhaps enormous proliferation, of the drug trafficking that operates in many of these countries now, very much under the thrall of the radical left or others in the totalitarian movement. The prospect that China and Russia and Iran will further destabilize the hemisphere to their benefit and to our detriment, including in strategic nations like Peru. One of the prospects there that Francisco has taught us about is the Belt and Road Initiative, creating one now underway and a second in the planning stages of vast mega ports capable of providing support not just to commercial shipping, of course, but also quite possibly to carrier strike groups of the People's Liberation Army Navy. These are the sorts of things that can conduce to a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0, perhaps one on steroids, if it's not attended to quickly. And then there's the problem, of course, that if we fail to recognize a destabilized hemisphere is going to result in still more illegal immigration into the United States. For all these reasons and others, we have a vital interest in what is going on in this part of the world, and we cannot continue to ignore it. So I would conclude by saying we need, as others have indicated, both an appreciation of what's afoot and US leadership in addressing it. We need to engage specifically in encouraging outcomes that are conducive to freedom and that are resistant to the seductions and temptations and ultimately the penetration and domination of our region by our enemies. This will be playing out literally this weekend in Chile and shortly in two other very important allies of this country, Colombia and Brazil. And finally, I would just say we need to think very innovatively, and certainly, again, not just at a rhetorical level, not just at a policy level, but at an actual applied policy and operational level, in countering the neo-colonialism that is at work in our hemisphere. And it's not just Iran and Hezbollah, it's not just Russian arms merchants, it's communist China, which is now engaging in virtually every country, including, I'm sorry to say, the United States, with what amounts to the Belt and Road colonial hegemonic infrastructure build out. That must be resisted, again, in practical ways, including with our private sector. So these are thoughts about what might be part of, if you will, a Monroe initiative. We'll be further addressing in the days to come both its nomenclature and its content. I hope you will continue to follow the work we're doing in this informal hemispheric security coalition sponsored by our Center for Security Policy and the Center for Secure Free Society. And also our thanks to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Carlos Ponce specifically, and of course, Francisco Tudela, former Vice President of Peru, for your leadership, and I hope our continued collaboration. Also, watch the Center for Security's website, securefreedom.org, for this important new paper by Francisco Tudela about the threat the new government of Peru poses to our hemisphere. With that, we'll close up, and I want to say again, thank you to all of you for listening. I hope that you will look for this modestly edited video and share it with others who need to be taking aboard this information and, more to the point, becoming part of the solution to the challenge we are now facing in our hemisphere to freedom and to free markets. We'll be talking with you again in the near future, I hope. Stay tuned and check out securefreedom.org for more. Thank you for listening.